There are people in this world who build their entire existence around certainty, not the grand certainties of faith or philosophy, but the small, manageable certainties of routine. Harold Bennett was one of these people, and his certainty began every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m. when he pushed through the glass door of Rosie's Cafe on Maple Street, hearing the familiar chime of the bell and breathing in the rich, dark scent of coffee being brewed. At 47 years old, Harold had perfected the art of invisibility. He was the kind of man people's eyes slid past in crowds, average height, graying hair cut conservatively short, wire-rimmed glasses that he'd worn the same style of for 20 years, clothing in shades of gray and beige that seemed designed to help him fade into backgrounds. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, occupying a cubicle on the third floor where he'd sat for 19 years, processing numbers with meticulous accuracy and speaking only when absolutely necessary. His co-workers knew almost nothing about him beyond his professional competence. He didn't attend happy hours or office parties. He didn't participate in secret Santa or birthday celebrations. When people asked about his weekend plans, he offered vague, pleasant responses that discouraged follow-up questions. Oh, just quiet time at home, or catching up on some reading. After a while, they stopped asking. But Harold wasn't antisocial, exactly. He was self-contained. He'd learned early in life that emotions were dangerous, that opening yourself to other people meant opening yourself to pain, and that the safest way to live was to keep your life small, controlled, predictable. Routine was armor against chaos. Silence was protection against vulnerability. Rosie's Cafe had been part of his routine for 12 years, ever since he'd moved to this town after his previous life had quietly imploded in ways he never discussed. The cafe occupied a corner building on Maple Street, a two-story brick structure that had probably been built in the 1920s, with large windows that let morning light spill across worn wooden floors and mismatched tables. The walls were exposed brick on one side and painted cream on the other, decorated with local artwork that rotated every few months and vintage coffee advertisements that looked like they'd been there since the place opened. Rosie herself, a woman in her 60s with silver hair in a perpetual messy bun and an inexhaustible supply of flannel shirts, had owned the cafe for 30 years. She opened at 7:15 every morning without fail, and Harold was always her first customer. He'd arrive at 7:14, wait on the sidewalk for exactly 60 seconds, then enter as she was unlocking the door. "Morning, Harold," she'd say, the same greeting every day, delivered with a warmth that asked for nothing in return. "Morning, Rosie," he'd reply, and that would be the extent of their conversation. He'd order the same thing, medium black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sit at the same table by the front window, the one tucked into the corner where he could observe the street without being easily observed himself. The table was small, round, just large enough for his coffee cup and the newspaper he'd bring, with two chairs though he only ever used one. Table 7. He'd been sitting there every morning for 12 years. The cafe would gradually fill around him as the morning progressed, students with laptops, elderly couples sharing the newspaper, mothers meeting for coffee after school drop-offs, business people grabbing drinks before heading to their offices. The sounds would build into a comfortable symphony, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups and spoons, the murmur of conversations, the soft jazz Rosie played through tinny speakers. But Harold would remain in his corner, an island of stillness in the gathering activity. He liked the predictability of it. The sameness. The way each morning unfolded like a script he'd memorized, requiring no improvisation, no surprises, no decisions beyond whether to have a second cup of coffee, he usually did. This routine was the foundation of his day, the calm before he had to navigate the slightly more unpredictable world of his office job. But the routine was more than just comfort. It was penance. It was vigil. It was the way Harold marked time in a life that had stopped moving forward 23 years ago, the day his younger sister Rebecca disappeared. She'd been 17, he'd been 24. She'd walked out of their childhood home one Saturday afternoon to meet friends at the mall and never came home. No note. No warning signs. No body ever found. Just absence where a person used to be, a void that had never been filled. The police had investigated for months. Harold and his parents had posted flyers, organized searches, appeared on local news, done everything people do when someone they love vanishes. But Rebecca had simply evaporated, as if she'd never existed at all. The case went cold. His parents had moved away, unable to live in the house where her empty bedroom was a constant accusation. Harold had stayed, though he'd eventually relocated to this town 3 hours away, unable to leave but unable to stay. He never spoke about Rebecca anymore. Never mentioned to his coworkers or neighbors that he had a sister, or had had a sister, or was still waiting, always waiting, for answers that would probably never come. But every morning at table 7, as he sipped his black coffee and watched the world wake up outside the window, he thought about her. Wondered where she was. Wondered if she'd suffered. Wondered if, somewhere in a parallel universe where things went differently, she was also sitting in a cafe, wondering what had happened to her older brother who'd failed to protect her. This morning, a Tuesday in late October, with autumn settling into the town like a cold hand pressing down, the trees along Maple Street dropping their leaves in russet and gold drifts, began exactly like the 4,380 mornings before it. Harold arrived at 7:14, waited on the sidewalk for 60 seconds while watching the last stars fade from the graying sky, then pushed through the door as Rosie flipped the sign from closed to open. "Morning, Harold," she said, already moving toward the coffee machine. "Morning, Rosie." The cafe was empty at this hour, as it always was. Just Harold and Rosie and the warm smell of coffee and the soft jazz playing, something with piano today, gentle and melancholic. Harold took his usual seat at table 7, set down his newspaper, and waited for his coffee. Rosie brought it over herself, as she always did for the first customer. "Here you go. Cold one today. Is it?" Harold hadn't really noticed the weather. He noticed so little beyond his routines. Supposed to drop below freezing tonight. First frost coming. She lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. "Enjoy your coffee, Harold." He nodded his thanks and she returned to her counter, beginning her own routine of preparing pastries and setting up for the morning rush. Harold took his first sip. The coffee was perfect, as it always was, rich and slightly bitter, and unfolded his newspaper. The front page was the usual mix of local news and national headlines: city council meeting, controversy over a proposed development, the high school football team's winning streak. Harold skimmed without really reading, his mind elsewhere, as it always was. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. He looked up from his newspaper, some instinct making him glance at the other chair at his table, and there was someone sitting there. A young woman, maybe early 20s, with pale skin and dark hair pulled back in a style that looked oddly dated, not modern retro but genuinely old-fashioned, as if she'd stepped out of a photograph from the 1950s. She wore a gray wool coat with a collar that was slightly too large, the kind of garment that spoke of a different era's fashion sensibilities. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at Harold with an expression of calm friendliness, as if they were old acquaintances meeting for a planned coffee date. Harold's first thought was confusion. He hadn't seen her enter, hadn't heard the door chime, hadn't noticed any movement. His second thought was concern. Table 7 was his table, everyone who came to the cafe regularly knew that, and this woman was clearly not a regular. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his voice polite but firm, "but this is your table." "I know." Her voice was warm, slightly amused, with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I'm not here to take it from you, Harold. I'm here to talk to you." The use of his name sent a chill down his spine. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," she said, and smiled as if she'd made a joke. "But you will. We're going to become quite well acquainted over the next few weeks, I suspect." Harold glanced toward the counter where Rosie was arranging muffins in the display case. She hadn't looked up, hadn't seemed to notice that someone else had entered the cafe. The bell above the door definitely hadn't chimed, he would have heard it. "How did you get in here?" he asked. The woman tilted her head, still smiling that small, enigmatic smile. "The usual way. Through the door." But that was impossible. Harold would have noticed. He always noticed when people entered. It was part of his vigilance, his awareness, his need to track his environment for potential disruptions to his carefully maintained peace. He looked at her more closely now, trying to understand what felt so wrong. She wasn't translucent or glowing or any of the obviously supernatural signifiers from movies. She looked solid, real, present. But there was something about her that his brain kept trying to reject, some quality that didn't quite fit into the normal world. Her movements, he realized. They were too smooth, too fluid, as if she wasn't quite subject to the same physics as everything else. And when she breathed, did she breathe? He watched her chest and couldn't detect any rise and fall. "You don't believe in ghosts," she said, as if reading his thoughts. Her tone was conversational, almost cheerful. "That's perfectly all right. Most people don't until they have to." Harold felt his mouth go dry. "Excuse me?" She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, though Harold noticed with creeping horror that her elbows didn't actually touch the wood. They hovered perhaps a millimeter above the surface, creating the impression of contact without actual physical connection. "You've been looking for answers, Harold Bennett," she said, her voice dropping to something more serious, more kind. "For 23 years, you've been looking. Every morning you sit at this table, and you think about your sister Rebecca, and you wonder what happened to her." The world seemed to tilt. Harold gripped the edge of the table, his hands actually touching it, solid and real and desperately trying to anchor himself. "Who are you? How do you know about?" "Because I'm like her," the woman said simply. "Not exactly like her. Our stories are different. But we both ended up in the same place, so to speak. The place where missing people go." Harold felt tears burning behind his eyes, the grief that never truly faded, that he'd learned to carry like a weight he'd gotten used to but never stopped noticing. "Rebecca," he whispered. "You know something about Rebecca?" The woman's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "She didn't run away, Harold. She didn't choose to leave you. What happened to her wasn't her fault, and it wasn't your fault either, though I know you've been carrying that guilt for more than 2 decades. Then what happened? Where is she?" His voice cracked, all his carefully maintained composure shattering like glass. The woman reached out as if to take his hand, and Harold watched in fascinated horror as her fingers passed through the coffee cup between them without disturbing it, without creating any ripple or movement. She stopped her hand above his, close enough that he could feel coldness radiating from her skin, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence. "You won't find her by looking in the living world," she said gently. "But you're closer than you think. This town, Harold. This town where you ran to escape your memories, it called you here for a reason. The answers you've been seeking are buried here. Literally." Harold was shaking now, his whole body trembling with the weight of what she was saying, what she was implying. "I don't understand. What are you telling me?" The cafe around them continued its morning routine, Rosie humming behind the counter, the coffee machine hissing, the jazz playing soft and melancholic. But at table 7, the air had turned freezing cold, and Harold could see his breath forming small clouds. "Something old is waking up in this town," the woman said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something that's been sleeping for a very long time, something that doesn't stay buried. And when it wakes fully, when it breaks through, the disappeared will have their chance to be found. The lost will have their chance to be remembered. The dead will have their chance to speak. This doesn't make any sense. You're saying Rebecca is here? In this town?" "Part of her," the woman said cryptically. "The part that matters. The part that's been waiting for someone to find her, to hear her story, to give her peace." She pulled her hand back slowly. "But Harold, when that moment comes, when the buried starts breaking through, you have to be ready. You have to be willing to see what others won't, to hear what others can't, to face truths that will break your heart even as they finally let it heal." Harold stared at her, his mind racing, trying to process impossible information through the rigid framework of his rational, ordered worldview. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? A promise, she said simply. The lights in the cafe flickered, once, twice. Rosie looked up from her work, confused, glancing at the light fixtures as if they'd personally offended her. The jazz hiccuped, the record skipping or the digital file glitching, creating a moment of distortion that sounded almost like voices. Promise me, the woman said, more urgently now, that when the moment comes, you won't run. You won't hide behind your routines and your silence and your carefully constructed walls. You were never meant to live quietly, Harold Bennett. You were meant to witness. You were meant to remember. You were meant to be the bridge between what was lost and what can still be found. She stood up, though Harold didn't see her actually rise. She was just suddenly standing, her gray coat hanging perfectly still despite the movement. She reached out one more time, her hand hovering just above his, and the cold intensified until Harold thought he might shiver apart. Do you promise? She asked. And Harold, moving on instinct or desperation or 23 years of accumulated grief finally finding an outlet, nodded. I promise. The woman smiled, genuinely warm, genuinely grateful. Then we'll meet again soon. Sooner than you think. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the cafe into darkness for 2 full seconds. In that darkness, Harold felt the cold retreat, felt the presence across from him simply cease to exist. When the lights came back on, he was alone at table 7. The chair across from him was empty. The woman in the gray coat had vanished as completely as if she'd never been there at all. Harold sat frozen, his heart hammering, his hands still gripping the edge of the table. His coffee was still steaming gently, exactly as hot as it had been when Rosie brought it over. His newspaper was still folded to the same page. Nothing had changed except everything. You okay, Harold? Rosie's voice made him jump. She was standing near his table, concern on her weathered face. You look like you've seen a ghost. The phrase, innocent, idiomatic, landed with weight. Harold forced himself to breathe, to smile, to be normal. I'm fine. Just, lost in thought. Well, don't get too lost. Life's too short to spend it all in your head. She patted his shoulder gently and returned to her counter. Life's too short. Harold almost laughed at the irony. He'd spent 23 years living a half-life, marking time, going through motions, maintaining routines while his actual existence remained frozen at the moment Rebecca disappeared. And now someone, was telling him that could change. That answers existed. That his sister could be found. If he was willing to believe the impossible. If he was willing to break his carefully constructed routines. If he was willing to become someone other than the quiet, invisible man who'd been sitting at table 7 for 12 years. Harold looked out the window at Maple Street, watching early morning commuters hurrying past, watching the town wake up to another ordinary day. Except it wasn't ordinary. Not anymore. Something old was waking up, the ghost had said. Something that doesn't stay buried. And Harold had promised to witness it. Whatever that meant. Whatever it cost. He picked up his coffee with trembling hands and took a sip. It tasted different now, not the coffee itself, but his perception of it. Everything tasted different when you just promised a ghost you'd face the truth about your sister's disappearance. Tomorrow morning, he'd be back at table 7. Not because of routine this time. Not because of comfort or penance or the need for predictability. But because the ghost had promised they'd meet again. And Harold intended to keep his promise. Even if it meant his quiet life, his safe, small, carefully controlled existence, was about to shatter into pieces he might never be able to put back together. The awakening. Harold didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed in his small, tidy apartment, 1 bedroom, minimal furniture, everything in its place, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation with the ghost. Every rational part of his brain insisted he'd imagined it, stress-induced hallucination, waking dream, some kind of psychological break after 2 decades of suppressed grief. But the cold. He couldn't explain the cold. It had been real, physical, undeniable. And Rosie's lights had flickered. The jazz had skipped. Those were objective phenomena, witnessed by someone other than him. Something had happened at table 7. Something his accountant's mind couldn't reconcile with the ordered universe he'd built around himself. He gave up on sleep around 4:30 a.m. and went to his desk, where his laptop sat closed. He opened it, hesitated, then typed into the search bar, Maple Street Town History Disappearances. The results were mundane at first: local news stories, historical society archives, census records. Harold's town was called Ashford, population 23,000, founded in 1847, economy based on light manufacturing and serving as a bedroom community for the larger city 40 miles away. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested buried secrets or waking horrors. But then, on page 3 of the search results, he found something, a blog post from someone named Jennifer Marsh, dated 5 years ago, titled, The Missing of Ashford, An Incomplete History. Harold clicked it. The blog was amateur, poorly formatted, but the research appeared meticulous. Jennifer had compiled a list of people who disappeared from Ashford over the past 150 years, not people who'd moved away or died in documented ways, but people who had simply vanished. The list was longer than Harold had expected. Much longer. 1887, Margaret Sullivan, age 19, disappeared while walking home from church. 1903, Thomas Chen, age 34, disappeared after his shift at the mill. 1924, Catherine O'Brien, age 27, disappeared from her home while her husband was at work. 1945, James Whitfield, age 42, disappeared while fishing at Ashford Pond. The list continued, dozens of names, spanning more than a century. Some years had no disappearances. Others had multiple. But the pattern Jennifer identified in her analysis was chilling: every disappearance happened in October. And every disappearance happened within a quarter-mile radius of what was now Maple Street. Harold felt his skin prickle. Table 7 sat on Maple Street. He'd been sitting there every morning for 12 years, right in the center of whatever this pattern was. Jennifer's blog post concluded, "I don't know what's happening in that part of town. Maybe nothing, maybe it's just confirmation bias, finding patterns where none exist. But I've lived in Ashford my whole life, and my grandmother used to tell stories about the hungry ground near Maple Street, about places where the veil between worlds grew thin. I'm not saying I believe in that. But I'm not saying I don't." The blog had no comments. When Harold searched for Jennifer Marsh, he found an obituary from 3 years ago. She'd died in a car accident, no suspicious circumstances noted. Harold closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment, feeling the shape of something terrible beginning to form in his mind. His sister Rebecca had disappeared in a different town, 3 hours away. But he'd moved to Ashford afterwards, supposedly at random, supposedly just looking for a fresh start somewhere no one knew his story. What if it hadn't been random? What if something had called him here, had been calling all of them, the disappeared and those who mourned them, to this specific place for a specific reason? At 7:14 a.m., Harold was standing outside Rosie's cafe, just as he had every morning for 12 years. But this time, his hands were shaking. This time, he was terrified of what, or who, might be waiting inside. The door unlocked. Rosie appeared, smiling her usual warm greeting, noticing nothing unusual about him. "Morning, Harold." "Morning, Rosie." His voice sounded normal, even to his own ears. He'd gotten very good at sounding normal. He ordered his coffee, took his seat at table 7, and waited. The cafe filled gradually with the usual morning crowd. Students with textbooks. Elderly couples. Business people scrolling through phones. The sounds built into their familiar symphony: espresso machine, clinking cups, murmured conversations. Everything normal. Everything ordinary. Except that Harold could feel it now, what he'd been too numb to notice for 12 years, the coldness that radiated from a specific point in the cafe. Not everywhere, just around table 7. Just in this corner where he'd been sitting, day after day, year after year, atop something that wanted to be found. At 8:07 a.m., a young man Harold had never seen before walked into the cafe. He was perhaps 25, dressed in outdated clothing, bell-bottom jeans, a faded band t-shirt from the 1970s, long hair that hadn't been in style for decades. He looked around the cafe with confused curiosity, as if he'd never been here before and wasn't quite sure how he'd arrived. No one else seemed to notice him. Rosie didn't greet him. The other customers didn't look up. And when the young man walked directly through one of the occupied tables, literally through it, passing like smoke through solid matter, Harold understood. Another ghost. The young man's eyes found Harold's, and recognition sparked. He approached table 7 and sat down in the chair across from Harold, the same chair where the woman had sat yesterday. "You can see me," the young man said. Not a question. A statement of relief. Harold nodded, not trusting his voice. "I'm Michael," the ghost said. "I've been here a long time. 38 years, I think. It's hard to keep track." He looked around the cafe with something like longing. "I used to come here when it was still called Jenny's Diner. Before Rosie bought it. Before they renovated." "What happened to you?" Harold asked quietly. Michael's expression darkened. "I was looking for my girlfriend. She'd disappeared a week earlier, just vanished from her apartment. I thought maybe she'd left town, but her family was frantic. So I started investigating, asking questions." He paused. "I asked the wrong questions to the wrong people. Or maybe the right questions. And then I disappeared too." "The hungry ground," Harold said, remembering Jennifer's blog post. Michael looked surprised. "You know about that?" "I'm starting to." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Michael leaned forward, his movements creating no sound, no disturbance in the air. "It's waking up," he said. "Can you feel it? The thing below. It's been sleeping for so long, but something's changing. The barriers are weakening." "What is it?" Harold asked. "I don't know. None of us do. We're stuck on this side, in between, and we can't go deeper to see. But it's old. It was here before the town. Before the Europeans. Before anyone built houses or streets or cafes. It was here, and it was hungry, and every few years it would take someone." Harold felt sick. "My sister. Rebecca. She disappeared 23 years ago, in a different town. Could she be here?" Michael finished. "Maybe. If what took her is connected to what's beneath this place. The hungry ground isn't just here, Harold. It's everywhere the veil is thin. But this spot, Maple Street, this cafe, whatever's underneath, this is the center. This is where it all connects." Before Harold could respond, the lights flickered again. Longer this time. 5 seconds of darkness, and in that darkness, Harold heard something, a sound like wind through vast caverns, like whispers in languages older than language, like the earth itself groaning. When the lights came back, Michael was gone. But sitting in his place was an elderly woman in a dress from the 1920s. Then the lights flickered again, and she was replaced by a teenage girl in 1960s clothing. Then a middle-aged man in Victorian-era garments. Then a young woman in contemporary jeans and a t-shirt who looked like she'd disappeared last week. The ghosts were appearing faster now, cycling through table 7 like a slideshow, each one looking at Harold with desperate hope, each one wanting to be seen, to be remembered, to finally tell their stories. And Harold, quiet, invisible, routine-bound Harold, realized with absolute certainty that he'd been chosen for this. Not randomly. Not by accident. He'd been drawn to this town, to this cafe, to this exact table because he was the one who could see them. The one who could hear them. The one who could finally, after 23 years of waiting and grief, find out what happened to his sister. Even if the truth destroyed him. Even if witnessing what was waking beneath Maple Street cost him his sanity, his safety, his carefully constructed quiet life. He'd made a promise to a ghost. And Harold Bennett, for all his faults, for all his years of hiding, was a man who kept his promises. The cafe hummed with its ordinary morning energy, completely unaware that at table 7, the veil between worlds was growing thin, and something old and hungry was beginning to wake. Even the quietest lives can be tied to extraordinary destinies. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth we can encounter, the idea that our careful routines, our chosen invisibility, our determination to live small and unnoticed lives might not protect us from being called to something larger, stranger, more frightening than we ever imagined. Harold Bennett spent 12 years believing that if he just maintained his routine, if he just kept his head down and his life ordered, he could avoid pain. He could avoid the grief of his sister's disappearance by never speaking about it. He could avoid the uncertainty of an unpredictable world by controlling every controllable variable. He could stay safe by staying small. But safety through smallness is an illusion. The extraordinary doesn't care about your preferences. Destiny doesn't check your comfort level before arriving. The shadows speak when they choose to speak, not when you're ready to hear them. For 12 years, Harold sat at table 7 completely unaware that he was sitting atop something ancient and hungry, that his morning routine was actually a vigil over a thinning veil, that his grief had drawn him to exactly the place where answers existed, if he was brave enough to receive them. How many of us are doing the same thing? Living quiet lives, maintaining careful routines, believing that if we just don't make waves or take risks or venture outside our comfort zones, we'll be safe from the extraordinary? How many of us have chosen invisibility as protection, only to discover that the universe has marked us for witnessing anyway? The ghosts found Harold not because he was special in the way we usually define it, not because he was brave or talented or powerful. They found him because his grief had made him permeable, because his years of silent mourning had thinned his own personal veil, because loss had opened him to seeing what others couldn't. Sometimes our wounds are exactly what make us capable of healing others. Sometimes our brokenness is what lets the light through. Sometimes the very things we're running from are leading us toward our purpose. Harold could have dismissed the ghost as hallucination. Could have convinced himself it was stress or lack of sleep or too much coffee. Could have doubled down on his routine, insisted on maintaining his carefully constructed normal life. And he would have been safe, in the short term. Comfortable, for a while longer. But he also would have missed his chance to find his sister, to understand what happened to her, to finally let his grief transform into something other than weight. The call to action here isn't comfortable. It's not, follow your bliss, or, believe in yourself, or any of the easy platitudes we tell each other. It's something harder, be willing to see what others won't. Be willing to hear what others can't. Be willing to face the extraordinary even when it terrifies you, even when it disrupts your carefully ordered life, even when accepting it means admitting that the universe is stranger and more mysterious and more demanding than you ever wanted to believe. You don't have to go looking for ghosts. But when they find you, when the extraordinary breaks through your ordinary life, when destiny taps you on the shoulder, when the shadows start speaking, don't run. Don't hide. Don't pretend you didn't notice. Because you were chosen for a reason. Your quiet life was always leading here. Your wounds were always preparation for this witnessing. The disappeared need someone to remember them. The lost need someone to seek them. The dead need someone to hear their stories and carry them back to the living world. Maybe that someone is you. Not because you're special. Not because you're ready. Not because you feel capable or brave or equipped. But because the extraordinary doesn't wait for perfect vessels. It works with who shows up. With who says yes. With who keeps their promises even when they don't fully understand what they've promised to do. Harold Bennett's quiet life is ending. His routine is shattering. His carefully constructed walls are coming down. And in the space where his old life used to be, something new is being born, something frightening, yes, but also something purposeful. Something that finally gives meaning to all those years of waiting. The shadows are speaking. The buried is waking. The thin places are revealing what they've been hiding. The only question is, are you willing to witness? Be StoryWise.